Donnie and Dolly. The team is supported by ableauctions.ca. Closing your business? We can help.
All of our guests today, including George St. Pierre later on, and Thomas Drance standing by as we speak from The Athletic, brought to you by our friends at bet99.net. Every game begins at bet99.net as we bring in, as we do every Friday from The Athletic and Canucks Talk, Thomas Drance. Thanks for doing this, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well, boys. You always put me right in front of a legend of some kind, but for all the talent that I've opened for on your program, no one else has been in the MCU. Opening for Georges Bartrock of Marvel Cinematic Universe fame.
Oh,
Let's
yeah.
go.
Well, he's going to talk about that, isn't he? We recorded the interview, so he will allude to that, okay? So you can look forward to that, Toms. By the way, you there's a couple of legends that you're dealing with here. George St. Pierre and, of course, Rick and his shirt. So there's that.
Okay. Yeah, both are tough.
Yeah,
without question.
As nails.
Hey, Thomas, before we get into last night and what happened with the Panthers coming back, you did an article in The Athletic on how Vancouver is oozing elite hockey talent, obviously led by Connor Bedard and Macklin Celebrini. That hasn't always been the case in Vancouver. A lot of great players have come from here. But what's changed?
Oh, man, there's an awful lot going on. I mean, we're now in about year 20 of the academy system. I think that's definitely part of the story, right? A public policy change that has enabled, a competitive advantage to those kids able to afford to effectively train during the course of the day in sort of affiliation with a variety of local high schools. That's part of the story. I think there's been sort of an amalgamation or an accumulation of top coaches, top skills coaches. You know, John Calvano is the sort of spring hockey coach for all of these kids, right? He's worked with a variety of these people. You go up and down sort of the list. You've got Barb Edelbaum, the skating consultant. There's just this sort of nexus of hockey training talent that's developed in this city, really sort of dating back to the days of Gilbert Brulé. And then, one thing I think you can't ignore is when you've got an elite player like Bedard, right? I think that changes the competitive pressure on the kids in and around his generation. Macklin Celebrini having the opportunity to see what Bedard was doing at the North Shore Winter Club when he was, 7, 8, 9. I think that was eye-opening. I think for a player like Zach Benson, you grow up having to check an Andrew Crystal or a Connor Bedard every night in winter hockey. That's going to make an impression on you in terms of how hard you have to work. I know that it did. And so I do think part of it, too, is just you have Bedard, you have this group of really high-end players. They all get along. They're competitive and they want to beat each other, but they're also supportive of each other. They're excited by the success that they're having across the board. I understand the families get along. They've all played spring hockey together forever. And I think as a result, you get sort of this generation of kids that have all pushed each other to, reach a point where we're probably going to have 5 guys from this city or its outlying areas, or at least who trained in this city, go in the first round in Nashville and probably a back-to-back first-round pick or first overall picks, out of the city of Vancouver. It's pretty incredible. And, it's, I think, a testament to the level of passion in this city to have this much talent coming out of it, given that, not like you can have an outdoor rink, right? Not like you can have a backyard rink in this city. So it takes a lot of commitment. It takes a lot of love for the game. And it's a pretty cool thing. I think a lot of Vancouverites should be proud of it. It's a really neat sort of golden generation that's just beginning their hockey careers, or their professional hockey careers anyway, in the next month.
Both Rick and I have kids involved in minor hockey, or have been involved in minor hockey. When it comes to the academy system and the zone system, Thomas, they're really expensive. And yes. I wonder how many athletes hockey is losing because their families can't afford to send them there, or late bloomers even. Is that the downside to this?
Oh, well, without question. And there's no doubt that this is a wildly expensive proposition. And, you think about the most expensive position in hockey, goaltending, right?
Yeah,
and how
time.
Canada's fallen behind, right? Certainly behind some of the countries like Sweden, for example, that really offer subsidized opportunities to make sure that they're not just getting the wealthiest kids, but also sort of the largest amount of talent into their national system to develop. I do think from a macro national hockey competitiveness standpoint, there is certainly some, inclusive policies that would be worth enacting to make sure that hockey is more accessible for everybody.
Okay, Thomas, we're getting down to the final stretches here. Canucks are still trying to clear cap space. They've been trying for how long? A year and a half? 2 years? It's been a while. Are they going to be able to do it, Thomas? Because I'm looking at Gavrikov signed this week. I'm looking at Severson signed today. These are guys that were on their radar, and they're not going to be able to do it. Can they? I mean, is there a chance, Thomas, they go to July 1st with no money?
It's really hard to imagine, isn't it?
Is it possible?
It's possible, but I think at the end of the day, if it really gets dire, whether you pay the price to move a deal or whether you bite the bullet on a buyout of some kind, right? That would be my expectation, as opposed to the club going into July 1 with absolutely zero flexibility. But we'll see. I mean, it might be more prudent. It honestly might be more prudent to just run it back and say, we believe in what we saw the last 25 games of the season under Rick Tocchet. That's who we are. We're going to count on internal improvement. And, we made our offseason moves ahead of the deadline when we brought in Beauvillier and Hronek and Rick Tocchet and, Ethan Bear. And this is going to be our team. I mean, is that better than paying full freight to get off a deal? Is that better than exercising a buyout on a really good player? Because let's be realistic, right? We don't expect them to look too seriously at an Oliver Ekman-Larsson buyout, right? It's too punitive. It's too long. Too big.
Too big.
And then you get to Besser and Garland, who might not have a ton of trade value, but make no mistake, those are good players, right? Yeah. I mean, those are good players. Maybe they're overpaid by $1 million each, but they're not overpaid by $4 million. They're not even remotely useless, right? They are useful pieces. Mm-hmm. So, it's a really tough set of circumstances and just sort of brings us back. The rubber's going to meet the road here in the next 21 to 22 days. Either the Canucks can deliver on what they told us after the deadline, right? We are comfortable with our options to move money. That was what Patrick Alvin said.
Yep.
Either that was right or it wasn't. And we'll know in 22 days. And, I think the pressure should be pretty high on this organization to figure it out, given how much they've talked about this stuff for the past year and a half and sort of failed to deliver on much of it.
Thomas, I heard the scout you were interviewing yesterday, and one thing I took away from that interview is that at 11, the Vancouver Canucks are going to get a really good player. Now, whether they keep the pick or not, that we don't know. But the way your scout was talking, 11 is going to bring you a very good hockey player.
Well, it's a strong draft. I mean, for sure, 11 is going to bring you a really good player. And things will begin to take shape further over the next couple of weeks, especially coming out of the combine. I do think teams will begin to zero in on the guys that they like. And, we'll see where the Canucks end up, sort of what options they end up having as they assess who they want to select 11th overall. That sort of Danielson, Vilander tier feels like it's getting a lot of buzz. Those are guys that feel like they're rising into the top 10 or if the fringes of it. It's a right-handed defenseman out of Sweden. It's a big Canadian centerman. You'd think that those would be very interesting to the Canucks, but I do think that there's a real possibility that one of the high-end wingers fall. And I think what's going to be really fascinating is, does a player who falls to 11 sort of entice the Canucks enough to convince them to truly go BPA as opposed to taking, the organizational need piece, which would be the centerman, the big centerman ideally, or the right-handed defenseman. That to me is going to be sort of the main dynamic if they keep 11. And as for the possibility of trading it, it's sort of like my reaction, Rick, yesterday to hearing your report on Brock Besser, right? Like, how can this organization afford to take any options off the table here? Right. Don't they have to be completely willing to consider everything if they're going to clear the type of cap space that they're going to need to upgrade their blue line and their center depth?
But we never said I never said the Besser's not going to get moved. I'm saying it's very quiet with them right now, and I think there are other players that are trying to actively move ahead before they move Besser. They could still pull the trigger on a Besser trade, but it's awfully quiet. No one's calling Thomas, and they're not really active on him right now. But one phone call changes everything.
Well, for sure. But I'm just saying, you should be active on every front if your goal is to clear money. That's my point more than anything.
Yeah, okay.
I'm surprised to hear that there's a $6.65 million player who they've sort of cooled their jets on in terms of aggressively looking to move. And I say this is one of Besser's biggest fans. I think he's a useful player. I just, sort of look at it and think, I don't know how this club can afford to pick and choose here.
Okay, very, 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 very quickly, Thomas. I mentioned we wanted to get your take on the Panthers. Rick Tocchet talks so much about resiliency. What can the Canucks learn about the Panthers' resiliency, which was really on display last night?
It was. So I have this sort of view, though, that it's one thing to look like you've got that dog in you and every shot is going in and every puck is getting stopped. Right? We saw that with the Bruce, there it is, Canucks run, right? The Panthers have had a lot of good fortune. 7-0 in playoff overtime is outrageous, especially when you've watched those games and seen some of the bounces that have gone their way. There's more than just being resilient at play in how Florida has constantly stepped up. But I loved the way that they played with the net empty. I thought their overtime goal was scintillating. Obviously, Carter Verhaeghe has, something in his jersey. And look, I thought this was Sergei Bobrovsky's best game, not just of the Stanley Cup final, but maybe of the last, the run that he's been on. I thought last night was his most impressive night because make no mistake, Vegas was the better team. That was a pure smash and grab by the Florida Panthers and one that staved off, an almost certain loss in the final. So good for them. Caps off. But, one thing I'd just note here, too, resiliency is a pendulum, right? It swings both ways. Mm-hmm. We've seen this Vegas team get pushed, too, like when Dallas won those 2 games in a row. And what did they do? They came out in game 6 of that series and put on probably the biggest beatdown of the playoffs. I'm really curious to see Vegas's response here. I suspect we're going to see them turn it up on Saturday.
At least it's interesting now. Hey, Thomas, you're always interesting. Thanks for this, my friend. We'll talk to you next Friday.
Thanks for having me, boys.
You bet.